I mean, I was hired by Marvel in the early aughts to teach a seminar twice a year. I did it for 6 or 7 years straight. And the first day of the seminar was me beating the hobbyism out of the guys who had been assigned to me. There's, we are making a living through our hobby. Comics are an inoculation process. When you meet comics for the first time, you either are stuck with them or you step away from them. And if you're stuck with them, you can't do anything but.
Hey, thanks for listening, and happy Halloween. Some of you know Molly, my wife, is a contemporary fine artist, and today her month-long gallery installation comes down. I'll place a link in the description. She had a closing reception this weekend, and I noticed her feeling down afterward, and it reminded me of that emotional sugar crash that I've felt many times following periods of hard work on projects or meeting certain moments with elevated energy. Hell, I get it after some of these recordings, but I mostly experience it following writing achievements, and that's like the time when the creeping doubt sneaks its way in. While it's unwelcome, I know it's temporary. I'm sure it's an evolutionary governor to, modulate our emotions up and down. I guess there's a nice little reminder that this is part of the creative process. You can't just always be firing on all cylinders, all the energy going out. These little down periods maybe kick us back into gear to do the next thing. So last week I mentioned I've activated the membership paid subscriptions on Substack. I think it's like $6 a month or $5 a month if you do the annual thing. That's the discount. So if you want to support the podcast, and if I get enough people signed up, I can take this, on the road, go to conventions to do live recordings, face to face with some people, which would be fantastic. Maybe a sort of a breakfast thing. The link for the subscription is in the description. I hope you do join me. Thanks. This week's guest is Howard Chaykin. Surprise, unless you didn't read the graphic or the show description. Howard, there's not a lot to say more than, everyone else has said. He is incredible. He is one of the greats. For me, he is one of the writers that really opened up my mind. There's probably 10 writers who just really impacted me, in the comic industry over my lifetime. But Howard was the one that woke me up from straightforward monthlies to, oh, you can do something more with the story. And I'm forever grateful, because I don't think I would see the world the way that I do if I didn't read his stuff. So getting to talk to him is quite the exciting moment for me in my creative life. The reason he came on was to pitch his new book, John Bentine's Fargo, Hell on Wheels. He's super excited about this. This is straight up action adventure adaptation of a novel in the giant comic format. I'm going to use his language. If you're a fan of his stuff, you're a fan of this. So that's just how I look at it. We got to talk about all sorts of stuff in this one. Not that he's name dropping, but man, he throws praise around for some people that are so deserving of it. Yeah, I got a lot out of this whole talk. I hope you do too. Check out the campaign. It's on Zoop. The link is in the description. You can go to zoop.gg. It'll be there. You can find them on all the social media platforms. You can find the link, I believe, on Howard's Instagram and maybe on his Facebook as well. And those links are here too. And the campaign ends on November 10th. So go check it out. Hell on Wheels. This is me with Howard Chaykin. As every year goes by, the reality of it all becomes stripped bare, I guess, in that sense, right?
I'm getting really bored, having spent the last, almost my entire life living in a world that is literally on the brink of apocalypse. It's really tiring. It's like,
there's this real strange, I mean, it's like it's this forced existential, anxiety that happens in this structure. And I let's just dive right into there. But like, I remember living in Manhattan during 9/11 was this terrifying event, and you saw it from, the front row. But what really hurt was seeing how the fear lever was utilized for other purposes rather than just healing or whatever the things needed to happen. Beyond just the sort of the basic payback factor. I mean, if someone comes and gets you, you want to punch him back, but it's tough. And I think that was sort of a big revelation. And then it's a constant. And who knows when it started?
I think it owes a lot to the transposition of media into a form of solely of entertainment. Everything is seen through the scrim
Right.
of enjoyment. That the that you must take pleasure in whatever you do, and that the fear lever you talk about is simply an extension of the theme park ride experience. That idea that everything has to have a heightened level of reaction.
Yeah.
I grew up assuming that I would wake up every day a pile of glowing ash,
Right.
as a result of a nuclear strike from our enemies overseas. And I remain utterly undisappointed about not having survived that.
Sure.
I'm good. I'm good. But I live when 9/11 happened, I was living in the San Fernando Valley in Sherman Oaks in California. I live in a small town about an hour and a half north of Los Angeles now. I live in a really isolated beach community where no one has any idea what I do for a living, and it's really good. And I drove down Ventura Boulevard a couple of days after the experience, and the streets were packed with people waving flags and making noisemakers. And I turned to my wife, who has an obsessive commitment to not giving a shit what anybody else is doing or thinking.
Right.
I turned to her and I said, "This is not going to end well."
Yeah.
I have I come from a very left wing family. I'm a red diaper baby, and in that context, we considered ourselves very patriotic Americans. We were flagging our own flags and things like that, and we identified our patriotism as being filtered through the sieve of our own politics, which was a perfectly acceptable way to function in those days. It isn't anymore.
Yeah.
The narrative of patriotism has been absconded and absorbed by a part of the culture that stumbled into grabbing it as my generation handed it over like shitheads.
Mm-hmm.
And the day that I saw my first flag burning was the day that I left the anti-war movement.
Okay.
Because I recognized that I was dealing with nihilism as opposed to patriotism.
Sure.
This is not the kind of conversation we're used to having on comic book things,
But the thing is, to me, that it's, listen, comic books are a medium. They're a medium just like, novels are. They're a medium just like film is. Whatever you choose to make your mark and your story, everything frames that for you. What you're talking about and your feelings, growing up under, the threat of nuclear annihilation or any of that type, frames your point of view in how yeah,
absolutely.
And tying it back into comics, and I was talking with a friend of mine the other day after we arranged this, and we were talking how influential your stories were to us as young would-be comic book creators in the 80s. And I mean, it's so funny, so American Flag being sort of like this sort of apex sort of like experience for me. I mean, when you chose to use the word plex as your sort of like governing word for many things, like, oh, it's the whatever plex, the thing plex. And I was like, wow, that's so interesting. But then that word crept into the lexicon as the years move forward. And I'm like, oh, like he was, you were being forward thinking in that respect. And it opened up the door for me, like in the concept of like, the impact of language and commentary on authority and social movements in the works that you were doing. Because I read your stuff at a higher frequency than I would read a book from a novelist. It just, that's just,
how old are you?
I'm 55 now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just getting a sense of where you were, physically, emotionally, and intellectually at the time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was a young teenager.
You were ripe.
I was right. My head was really soft and it was easy to poke into. But that kind of thing, like it really framed this sort of ability to take story and create commentary while still entertaining, but not truly being preachy. Do you know what I mean? Like you're not up there like Bono's, yelling something to the audience where people, it could be divisive versus bringing people along.
I live in a state of constant doubt. That self-doubt is what has sustained me through my entire career. And I will say right now that the first 10 years of that career, that self-doubt was utterly justified. But as I developed craft to serve the craft, my confidence grew, but I remain a cautious editor of my own sensibilities and my own enthusiasms and my own interests. And the idea of presenting a point of view without being preachy is the absolute apogee of what I'm seeking in my life. When I did Flag back in the early '80s, I'd not been in touch with Gil Kane for some time, and Gil called me out of the blue, having read the first two issues, and was incredibly flattering. And of course, it's like hearing good things from your dad.
Yeah.
And what he specifically said was, this book has a point of view that is it's just it sets its own tone and stays with it consistently. And that was for me. I'm either having flies or floaters. I can't quite tell. It's been my mantra since then. And I have an aversion to unsolicited advice, and
Right.
because I believe unsolicited advice is simply criticism bearding itself under the mask of good intentions. And so I in turn do not offer a portfolio of suggestions. It's just not my world. I lay out how I'm feeling about things, how I think about things, and then take it from there. I don't in any way encourage people to think or believe as I do, because my own personal experience dictates how I believe and how I think. But I am willing to tell people how I'm thinking, how I'm feeling.
Right.
And if there are those who agree, I'm good. If they don't, fuck you. I don't really care.
Right.
I learned a long time ago that whether others people think of me is none of my business, and that my self-esteem is based in no way on what other people feel about my work or how other people react to what I say. I hold grudges when people come at me, because I hold a grudge like a blood stain on silk. But I have to, and forgiveness has to be earned, because I'm a grudge holding son of a bitch. But by the same token, I make it a point to avoid reading anything about me, positive or negative,
Right.
simply because I'm not that easily flattered, and my feelings are easily hurt. So what the fuck? What do I gain?
Yeah. No, because it is. I mean, it's a trap, and I don't know. I don't even know if it's an easily flattered thing for me. I don't ever trust the honesty of it. I go, oh, yeah, you're just being kind or whatever the thing is, and it's very hard for me to even take it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the situation I'm involved right now, the reason I'm here, discussing the Fargo project, is it's a landmine. It's a minefield for me, because I've Mike has said, Mike is just hanging out, enjoying and watching the conversation. I've been studiously and conspicuously avoiding the crowdfunding world for
Mm-hmm.
years. Well, many of my colleagues have profited from it, and I was seduced into this. And again, I roll. It wasn't like I had to be direct kicking and screaming. I liked the project. It's an opportunity to do something. I used to remember when Graham Greene used to always talk about his entertainments and his serious works. Fuck that shit. That's nonsense. You bring I bring, fuck you, I bring the same level of effect and enthusiasm and effort to everything I do, whether I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing it for a super duper book from Marvel or DC, which is a rare occurrence, or I'm doing work for Image or someplace else. I mean, the work is the work. You have to do the
Yeah.
same level of commitment and craft, because if you don't, you're cheating yourself and you're cheating the audience. So the opportunity to do something along these lines gives me an opportunity to write and draw a period piece in a period that I really love. Um, and it does not have the political underpinnings of Flag or the social underpinnings of Times Squared or, frankly, the pornographic filth of Black Kiss.
Mm-hmm.
But what it does have is a a series of visuals that lend themselves to to graphics that I really enjoy creating, in tandem with a direct linear story that is a pleasure to transcribe. I mean, I've taken a 186 page book and turned it into a 96 page graphic novel, a phrase I loathe. It's a big fat comic book, kids. Let's
Sure.
call it what it is. Graphic novelists are people who wake up one morning and decide that comics is a new métier. And
Yes.
it's my métier since I was, old enough to, to read. So I mean, I've labored for this. So, my feeling is my responsibility to the work is to bring the same reflective effort to everything I do. It's irrelevant who I'm doing it for.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
That all dates back to American Flag. Was before American Flag, I was a sort of like a Jew wandering in the desert. I had no idea what I was doing. I stumbled into working for Byron Price, where I learned some craft, but Byron was just, an impossible person to work with him for. I did it twice, which demonstrates a really, a fool's judgment.
That's
But
maybe it's me, not them philosophy at first. When you're young, you're like, well, maybe I'm the one who made the mistake here.
it was my mistake to do it. I mean, it really
Mm-hmm.
was. I mean, no one ever profited working for Byron Price except for Byron Price. And again, if you want confirmation of this, there's a list of people I can give you. You can, oh yeah, Chaykin's right. He knows he's right. But Flag came at the nexus of a series of emotional and spiritual and physical and technical development on my part. I left comic books after a skimming fight I had with Jim Shooter, and went off and did something else for a living for a couple of years. And in that time, I developed a humbled interest in craft and a respect for craft. And for reasons which I remain completely mystified by it, I still have never gotten an actual answer as to why this happened. First Comics felt they could trust me with the kind of money they made and offered to me. And I just like, why? I remember sitting with my then wife and saying, what is behind this choice? Where are they
Right.
getting this? I mean, I had no idea. But it changed my life. It really did. It transformed me. But it also taught me a very valuable lesson, which is that the definition, from my perspective, of good has very little bearing on what the mainstream comic book audience identifies as good. It's a vast. It's separated by a chasm,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of that has to do with the fact that I wasn't good enough to do what was demanded of me in a commercial sense in the early 1970s. So I had to find other avenues to keep myself busy. And finding those other avenues led me away from what it was that had drawn me to comic books in the first place. And by the time I got good enough to do it, the good enoughness had ceased to have any particular value to me in service to that sort of material. That's a roundabout way of saying that when I do a superhero story, I'm a perfectly journeyman artist on that superhero story.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm much more interested in what's happening between the punch outs than I am in the punching.
Yeah.
And considering the fact that I was, that my primary mentor was Gil Kane, there's something curious about that because Gil's
Sure.
work is
He's
defined
great
by
punch out.
you know, he was the one who introduced the ballet and the Agnes de Mille idea to comic book fight scenes. I
Yeah.
described Jack's work. I described Jack Kirby's work recently as gymnastic hysteria, uh, and it is. But Gil's work was that gymnastic hysteria as channeled and filtered through the dogma of Vern Hogarth, who still Gil was, but dominated Gil for his thinking. And for me, um, I I learned everything I know about what I do for a living from watching Gil, but I don't draw anything like Gil. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
like Gil. I don't have that sensibility. My thinking has more in common with, say, Wallace Wood or Alex Toth or John Severin. Those are the three artists that I look at almost on a daily basis. And those three ethoses inform a lot of what I'm doing on Fargo. The I've oddly enough gone back to a lot of the Kurtzman stuff because there's a lot of methodical narrative built into this book that calls for the kind of word counting and panel counting that Kurtzman did.
Right.
I mean, I'm of the that there are three schools of storytelling in comics. There's Eisner, whose great genius was to transliterate the physical space of the Sunday page of the comic strip and transliterate it to the comic book page to create a different aspect ratio. And everybody was doing Eisner, including Jack. Everybody was doing Eisner.
Right.
Spirit and just everything. I mean, when I was a Golden Age collector, I never really identified that the quality books were the books to be collecting because those were really good books, as opposed to DC, which were kind of shitty, and Timely, which was just terrible. Marvel stuff was off. But in retrospect, I realized that Eisner had a crew of guys from Lou Fine, Mac Rayboy, Jack Cole, Alex Kotsky, all of whom went on to just great stuff and did great stuff for him. And then Kurtzman comes along and changes everything. Kurtzman introduces an emotional detachment that steps away from the jitterbug and moves into this sort of measured and reserved consideration of ideas. And then Jack and Steve and Lee and Stan come along, and what happens with Jack was doing Eisner, Jack was doing all this brilliant athletic stuff. I mean, I was a huge fan of the Fly, the Archie book. The wide angles. Sure. That and there's a grotesqueness about that I really don't. But when Stan starts making demands of Jack seems to lose much of that athleticism and replaces it with impact. And
right.
And for me, the Eisner stuff remains more interesting, and the Kurtzman stuff remains more interesting. I don't have my stuff doesn't have this sense of bludgeon. When I draw a punch thrown, I always feel like I'm operating in a realm that is uncharted territory for me. I just don't have that skill set. A lot of it is I'm a physical coward, so I tend to run away from fights as soon as I bust.
so no actual street practice of this. Yeah.
I mean, I've been beaten up too often to really engage with the idea.
So you're really good at drawing someone taking a punch.
I mean, look, I mean, it's an indication of the fact that nobody's reading Hey Kids comics is that I have not had the shit kicked out of me yet. I'm overdue. I really am.
That's it's interesting. I love I'm a big thinker about the tree, the comics tree, and you slide it down to, to Will and Jack and Harvey. And I think Harvey, but like there's a metronomic quality to Harvey's storytelling.
Exactly. I wish I will steal that from you right now.
Yeah. No, please. And and it's so unique, and I love trying to filter like where people come from within these trees, and I almost like, where does Toth pop in from that one? Like, does he spin off of Will? Like, is there's this sort of like, because it's not as sort of dramatic as Will typically was with his work.
I don't think Alex is influenced by comic book artists. I think he
Yeah.
comes directly from Kniff and Sickles, and and also the application of industrial design.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah. Sure.
there's a geometric quality to his work, particularly, you know, talking about Alex. Alex becomes Alex in the early 1950s. He's this phenomenal talent as a kid, but it's still unformed. And over the run of Sierra Smith, by the end of Sierra Smith, the backup feature in Dale Evans comics, he becomes himself. And then there's that Battle Flag of the Foreign Legion and Thunderjet. All of a sudden, he is
Right.
Alex Toth. And then he goes on and he does that phenomenal run of John Fury, on a Rexograph machine, mind you, same size. I mean, what? How do you do that? So,
Well, okay,
but
so that's
he was
they said
hampered
that.
by the. Yeah, sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
there's a technical. So you bring up a technical aspect in that, and I can tie this back into, because there are, there's artists who look at the medium with the technical eye, like what technology can I employ to improve what's happening on the page. So Jim Steranko, for example, or Alex Toth, like how are they doing these? Like, I don't know why we're not using this technology. It's sitting there. The printers use it. Why can't we? Magazines use it, or whomever uses it, we should use it too. So then you get the color holds starting the late 70s, when people started, doing red line to do color holds, which, but then like for my dollar, I recognize a sense of graphic design even before I probably knew what it was coming out of your work. The choice of typography and structure onto the page. So was that a cognizant choice for you?
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I love. I mean, I'm a mathematical moron. I mean, my college boards. I have 800 English boards, perfect score,
Hmm.
not a single wrong, and 400 math boards, which means I am mentally retarded in regard to math. Okay.
You're a
That
coin flip.
that said, my work is based almost exclusively on geometry.
Okay.
And it's the application of design came out of those couple of years that I was away doing other things for a living. And the problems I was solving for a living were to create a saleable standout image that would present itself in a 4-inch by 4-inch space.
Hmm.
And again, I'm not I have no gut. I am all cerebral. I'm all problem solving, solutions to problems. I do crossword puzzles every night because reading gets me worked up and crossword puzzles settle me down.
Okay.
And the application of graphic design flag came out of the 6 months that preceded actually doing the book, because the deal was made 6 months before I actually started writing and drawing the book, that I did academic study. I literally looked at stuff. How do I sell this idea? What do I do to make this idea work? And I was looking at everything from Lithopinion magazine, which was the magazine of the Amalgamated Lithographers Union, long gone. I have a complete set right over there, and it had features that Al Parker redesigns the American magazine. It's pretty astonishing. It's the best reproduced magazine you'll ever see in your life.
Yeah.
Looking at Otness and stuff, Otness was doing work with xerography, having been a Robert Fawcett type artist and a Noel Sickles type artist for years, was evolving into using xerography and photography and montage. Looking at Bob Peak's stuff and looking at Richard Saul Werman's stuff. I still haven't broken that code. Werman was a cartographer and designer, who
Wow.
in the
Okay.
80s, you know his work?
No, but I'm gonna look it up.
He did a series of books on tour guides. He attempted to reinvent the tour guide. Those oblong books people used to carry before cell phones and all
Mm-hmm.
that stuff. And what he would do is he would do exploded imagery of tourist visiting sites. He ended up doing this for hockey, baseball, and football as well, for people who didn't. I mean, I know nothing about sports, so these were perfect for me to get to explain and understand the game. And his thinking was so out there and just so abstract that to this day I still am trying to figure out a way to incorporate what he was doing in those books into my stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Some years back, I got a call from Joey Cavalieri at DC. Joey's one of my favorite editors in comics. He's one of my favorite people, and he's a really good editor. And he was doing a Western book that needed backup features, and he asked me if I do a couple. And I wrote two. One of them I was going to draw, and one of them was going to be drawn by Jose Garcia Lopez. I delivered the material, and the one that Garcia was going to draw, he paid for, and then said he couldn't do.
Oh no.
He wouldn't do it because he said the audience wouldn't get it. And I got it back, and I sold it to Dark Horse, and I offered it to Walter to draw, and Walter refused to draw because it wasn't comics.
Okay.
And I didn't know what that meant. I ended up drawing it myself, and what it was it was a pastiche of a job that John Severin did for Two-Fisted Tales, about a visitor from an alternate universe, in which Lincoln didn't die and all this other stuff. Okay. And the piece was called George Armstrong Custer: The Later Years, and it was basically about Custer winning the Battle of the Little Bighorn using the Beaufort gun and the Gatling gun, and becoming a spokesperson for the Gatling gun, and ultimately becoming the president of the United States and invading Canada. And because we should have invaded Canada years ago when there were only 32 people there, we could have had a lot more states, many more states. And I mean, it was met with crickets because it wasn't about it. It wasn't about super monster dragon space mutant power shit coming out of their faces, coming at them. So I recognize the fact that my definition of what comics is far more varied and open than it is for many. I mean, I identified years ago that to a great extent, the genius of Jim Steranko was to conflate Jack Kirby's, as I said, gymnastic hysteria with the chilly detachment of Bernard Krigstein and those jobs. And that's pretty fucking brilliant. That's not a connection I could have ever made. And I try to explain to people, when people talk about being influenced by Alex Toth, being influenced by Alex Toth is not like drawing like Alex Toth.
Right. Sure.
The way Alex Toth thinks. And that thinking is what interests me the most. I'm constantly trying to figure out ways to imply the presence, the existence of time in a static, non-plastic medium, and that's what comics is all about. Comics for me is about the representation of time through space, and it's I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday about the reason we opted for this particular volume of the Fargo series, the saga. It's called Hell on Wheels, and it involves a lot of trains and stuff. And trains immediately leapt out at me as a graphic idea that lends itself to the horizontal nature and the vertical nature of comics. There's an artist named Charles Sheeler, who was a photographer and artist of the 1930s and 40s. I think he worked into the 50s, who photographed machinery and industrial objects and painted them as well, and found the abstract graphic nature of industrial design. And his work just staggers me. I've used it a lot. I used it a lot in Flag, a great deal. I used it in Times Square, although Times Square harks back to more of the machine age, the that quasi American Deco, because Deco is, we call Art Deco, is actually machine age American art. Art Deco is much more fragile and French. We identify in the States as Art Deco, as machine age American design, with the introduction of new tooling that was able to create curvilinear shape. My wife and I were in New York in September, and one of our pit stops is always in the Museum of Modern Art shop. We love the MoMA store.
It's great
because it's design and stuff. And across the street is the Rockefeller House, and I'm crazy about the Rockefeller House. It makes me nuts. I love that building so much. And my wife doesn't quite understand why. I said, it's those curvilinear windows, babe. It's like it's like, yeah, that's what it's all about. These bubbling windows. It's just breathtakingly beautiful. And I mean, I left New York 38 years ago, the day before I turned 35, and I remain a New Yorker on permanent leave. Right? Like I say, I live in a small beach town. I look like a hobo, and I do. It's not irony; it's deadly true. Strad can confirm this. I look like a hobo. I'm having lunch with him later today. He will again be able to confirm this for you as well. And when I'm in New York City now, it's as a tourist, which is really wonderful. The New York I left behind is no longer exists. It's gone through Bloomberg, and it's gone through Giuliani, and it's gone through all these other Gavons who twisted it to their own devices. And I recognize the fact that so much of the way I draw and think derives from growing up as a child in a world that looked like Ouija's photographs. Because New York didn't really change from the late 1930s until the mid 1950s. The first accession to modernity in New York City was the building of Lever House on 54th and Park, and that building just changed the way that neighborhood was lit.
Mm.
I mean, the light that was reflected. New York City now has a cool bluish tinted light, which was the antithesis of what the light was like when I was a child. Because in those days, it was bounced off of red brick, and the light in New York was much warmer and not different, just not better, not worse, just different.
Mm-hmm.
And my kids were living down in Greenwich Village for quite some time. They lived in something called um, something with a center. It had been a transfer point for immigration. And when I went down to visit them in the village, it was like, holy shit, what happened here? Those ramshackle 5-story buildings are gone, replaced by these yuppie scum high rises, and it could freak me out, it really did, because I spent my boyhood down there. But I've said more than once. I'm rambling here, but this is all about the city, and so much of my work is defined by the urban life. When I read Jim Thompson's stuff, in my head, it always looked like Wallace Wood's urban nightmare stuff that he did for Crime Suspense and Shock Suspense.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
those slightly about to collapse tenement buildings, and just I love that stuff. I mean, and that I suspect was a reflection of Woody moving from the Midwest. This white guy from Minnesota, moving to Brooklyn and Manhattan, and being confronted with the film noir of his own experience and living
Sure.
it.
Yeah.
I love that. How's that for a ramble?
Nice.
Wow.
It challenges some of the best. But like, speaking of of that, of noir, I mean, like a lot of your works would be sort of classified within either a noir theme or a pulp theme. And then I kind of feel like you went into a more of a science fiction, so you could sort of tackle greater themes. And then you went into more of a speculative fiction where you could then take the earlier, pulp or, pulp themes and then apply something to it with an alternate kind of point of view. And is that where you kind of put your attention to in Fargo, or are you diving back into your sort of your pulp love?
Well, I mean, people think I'm a pulp guy, and I'm not really a pulp person.
Yeah.
I could never get through any more than a couple of shadows just to get a sense of this stuff. Doc Savage bored the shit out of me and all that stuff. But I was a real reader of the original paperback stuff. I mean, if by pulp you mean Richard Starks, Parker, and Grofeld novels, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
If by pulp you mean James Bond, yeah, that kind of stuff. Absolutely. I mean, the Fargo stuff, existed at a time when I was reading this sort of material, but it was below my radar because I wasn't reading Westerns, and the books were sold as Westerns. They are not Westerns in any traditional sense. If you accept, as I do, that the American Western is a narrative that starts around 1868 as the veterans of the Civil War are moving west, and ends around in the mid 1890s when the railroad fortunes that were accrued from financing the victory of the Union against the Confederacy have begun the process of milding the 20th century. Fargo is that guy who is a 19th century guy and rampant in the early 20th century. I'm of the mind that fortune, those railroad fortunes, which financed the 20th century, had the modern world in place by 1910. You had automobiles, you had airplanes, you had modern building techniques, you had the beginning of the urbanization, the shift from an agricultural society to an urban society. And most specifically, you had communication. I mean, let's not forget, David Sarnoff built his career, and built RCA and NBC on the basis of having stood on a ledge in a building in 1912 doing live broadcast of the Morse code terror coming out of the sinking of the Titanic.
Mm.
And that world, that universe is so appealing to me. That world that we think about as an alien landscape, but is when our world was built and forged. And Fargo, I described Fargo as what Conan would have been like had he ridden with Pike Bishop and Dutch in the Wild Bunch.
Okay, cool.
I mean the specifics of the character. The novels have a profoundly ritualistic sense. I mean, think about Nero Wolfe. If you've read the Nero Wolfe novels, the Nero Wolfe novels are extremely ritualistic. He has Archie. Archie's the narrator. The novels take place in a certain. It's Nero Wolfe of West 37th Street. Fritz is upstairs. And Francis. I mean, just it's there. It's all there.
Mm-hmm.
And these novels have that same ritualistic perspective because Fargo. I could not diverge for one of the elements of Fargo. I mean, I hate drawing revolvers. I like drawing automatics. Don't even make it sound here. Fargo is armed with a 38 revolver, and one of the best images I've ever seen in any film is that shot of William Holden, braced over a water cooled machine gun, waving a 1911 45 as they take on Mapache to avenge Angel's death. But I accrue to the material. And the ritualistic nature of the novels, the Hell on Wheels is number 15 in a series of 20. And one of the reasons I can do that is that there's no continuity from novel to novel. The character is pretty much the same in each book. It's pretty much like James Bond. I mean, nothing that happened in From Russia with Love has any impact on Thunderball. And the same is true here. And one of the pleasures I took in the novel, in doing the graphic novel, was to visualize the ritual of his weapons. That he's literally cataloging the guns and the knives, and everything gets played out that way. And the character is, again, Benteen took the character that Lee Marvin was playing in The Professionals, Richard Brooks's picture, and get a backstory and a career. The character in the film is called Fardon. Benteen took this character and gave him a backstory. He's got a great backstory. The character is he was orphaned by a Comanche raid and taken in by a farm couple who saw him as labor and stock, and they worked him to the bone. He ran away and ends up as a circus roustabout, a bouncer in a brothel, a prize fighter, cowpuncher, and ultimately ends up serving under Roosevelt in the Rough Riders. And I mean, I'm a huge TR guy. I mean, I loved Empire, one of Gore Vidal's counter histories, and that figures prominently. It deals directly with TR. Vidal had no use for Teddy Roosevelt. I have a great deal of use for Teddy Roosevelt, and the fact that Tom Mix claimed to ride with the Rough Riders, I'd love to know if that were true. And I've used the Rough Riders as a metaphor for experience in any number of jobs. And it was terrific to find out that he was a guy who did. And Teddy figures prominently as one of the story points, one of the plot points in Hell on Wheels. And one of those weapons I mentioned earlier was a gift from TR. It's a fowling piece, as they say in England, which, Fargo knocked the stock off and cut off to a foot of the barrel, and now has a
Mm-hmm.
sawed-off shotgun that is a perennial, deadly part of his arsenal. And the Professionals and the Wild Bunch, for me, are the two great transitional westerns, and their take on the vanishing landscape that these guys had populated, and how these guys were dealing with a present that was not welcoming to their sensibilities is really appealing to me.
Yeah.
And Fargo is not a guy who is particularly afflicted with self-doubt. So he's a guy who is functioning just fine in terms of the standards of the 20th century. One of the novels begins with him serving as a stuntman and consultant in an early Hollywood film. And we 86 that as our first book out front, just because it felt like a note that would make an exception of that material, and that the Hell on Wheels, as it is as 15 in 20, has more of a generalized appeal, that it introduces the character in media res. Page 1 of the book, he's just right there, and the character delivers who he is through action.
Mm.
And that for me is what it's about. I mean, there are more than usual silent sequences in this book, simply because I opted not to do descriptive captions. I didn't think they were necessary. One of the pleasures of writing and drawing this stuff at one point together with one hand is that I can deliver images and panels that are endowed with narrative value. And it's always been my experience, with very few exceptions, when writers write books for me to draw, I collaborate, they tend to write at me as opposed to for me. And there are only a couple of exceptions who don't fall into that trap. My job as a comic book artist is not as an illustrator, but as a graphic designer in the service of narrative. And the job I see is to transliterate a literary idea into its visual equivalent. And one of the things that came from doing this adaptation, is taking 186 pages and turning it into 96 pages of graphic novel, again, graphic novel, was that there's an enormous amount of stuff that is described and redescribed and overdescribed, as there is in all adventure fiction, that call for one image. And there's a sequence in the book that doesn't exist for any particular reason other than to talk about a piece of contemporary technology. And I thought about cutting the sequence entirely, until I realized that it gave me an opportunity to tell backstory through narrative, not descriptive captions,
right,
but narrative captions, as we were looking at something that was not directly related to the narrative being told. And that was a key. I mean, again, you talk earlier about technology. I think technique, and the idea of counter narrative really appeals to me. The idea of telling an episodic, disjointed fable, but with overlapping narratives. And Fargo is more straightforward than I would compare Fargo as in its straightforward nature to what I did in Marked Man and Midnight of the Soul, both of which are noir-esque crime pieces. But there are also some experimental moments of graphics where I incorporate a lot of Kurtzman technique. There's gunplay in the book that I felt required that metronomic effect that you mentioned.
Yeah,
I thought that was a really solid way of depicting these particular confrontations. So
Okay, that's really actually super clarifying. The you said something about um the Wild Bunch and the Professionals. I also think of like the Misfits, like of films of the time that sort of, you know, change our mindset about something. Um,
The Misfits is a movie that people love that I'm not fond
yeah.
of. For me, my wife had never seen anything. She grew up like a Mormon. I have no idea where she was coming from. She knew no rock and roll, no movies, no TV or nothing. Just so during the lockdown, the pandemic lockdown, I curated a subjective film festival.
Mm-hmm.
Showed her a ton of. When I tell you the things that she saw for the first time, you'll think I'm being hyperbolic, but I'm quite literally serious. I mean, Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, Citizen Kane, The Adventures of Robin Hood, all. And one of the things about Clark Gable is that I showed her it happened one night. Now
Okay.
she'd seen Gun Movement, and she loved it happened one night. I mean, it was like, let's see more. And I started looking, and I realized I actually approached Mike about this. As a matter of fact, Gable was a movie star who didn't do a lot of good movies, like Errol Flynn.
Sure, I get you.
Whereas Jimmy Stewart, Henry Fonda,
Yeah.
Gary, these guys did shitloads of great stuff. Okay. And I tried to watch The Misfits, which I'd not seen, in many, many years. And I found it dour and phony at the same time. And I'm not a Miller guy. I really am not.
Right.
I've been back and forth with a pal of mine who's at a noir festival in DC right now, and they were showing All My Sons. And I've never seen the film version. I've seen the stage production, but I find Miller so just exhaustingly self-serious.
Right.
There's this, it's just this suicide poet hand to the back of the forehead. Oh, please, shut up. Enough with you already. And I didn't warm to the picture. I like Montgomery Clift, and I like Marilyn Monroe in small doses. But for me, if I'm going to watch a Western with Clift, it's going to be Red River. I mean, there you
Okay.
go.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
That's fair. Yeah, I mean, I'll probably have to give it a rewatch. I've been doing this. I mean, you remember like in the 70s, how like Channel 9, Channel 5, and Channel 11 like would have all these movies on the weekends, and
well, nine had RKO. Channel 5 had the Warner Brothers franchise,
mm-hmm.
and 11 had all the independent weird shit.
They were on every Saturday and Sunday, like in the afternoons, and many were inappropriate, for the age of the people viewing. I remember sitting down, and this is mid 70s, and 3 Days of the Condor comes on, and I'm like, okay, I like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, so I'm gonna like this. So I sit down, and then I'm absolutely like just punched in the solar plexus, the second the mailman comes in, but all in a good way. But man, these films just laid some heavy stuff down on you. So like that's when I engaged the Misfits as a 9-year-old kid. So I'm like seeing
your parents. Hey.
Well, they were divorced many years before and not paying attention to me.
Well, welcome to my world.
Yeah.
I mean, I've told this story any number of times that I had German measles at my bar mitzvah. It affected 30 people. Yeah, America. And so I spent the week after my bar mitzvah at home in bed, kind of hallucinating in fever, and was watching Channel 5, which had all the Warner Brothers product. And it was a week where they were showing the second cycle of gangster pictures from the 30s and early 40s. They used the same cast, the same sets, to do comedies. Brother Orchid, A Slight Case of Murder, All Through the Night, City for Conquest. And I realized I'm watching Alan Jenkins and J. Edward Brophy, two Warner's contract players, and Frank McHugh and all these cats. And I realized, holy fuck, everybody in the movies who's supposed to be stupid sounds like me. And I made a concerted effort at that point to develop this mid-Atlantic accent that was separate and distinct from the Bowery, because I sounded like Leo Gorcey from the Bowery
Yeah.
Boys.
Okay.
And I taught myself not to, And I mean, I'm a product of Brooklyn and Queens as a kid, and of course it was a terrible mistake on my part, because Joe Papp always said that the guys who built the atomic bomb that ended the Second World War all graduated from the same class at MIT, who in turn had come from the Bronx High School of Science and Boys High. So the Second World War was won by guys whose accents sounded like Leo Gorcey and Hunts Hall from the Bowery Boys, which I thought was fun. I mean, it really was.
That's hilarious.
True.
But like thinking about like all those cinematic influences or stage influences or whatever they are, as we kind of grow up, we I don't know how the way we internalize them at a younger age is different than when we re-examine them. But like, it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, and the idea of like breaking the code, like how important that, like, I always called it like a forensic approach to something. Like there are very few, visual creators that I can't sort of forensically break down how they got to the solution. Right. And then the ones who I can't absolutely just go, it was A, B, C, D, E, F. I love them forever, because there's a magic in their application of technique, which you go, this is it. This is the thing.
We are brothers here. I mean, that I couldn't have put it. I mean, I remember very specifically, I was at Upstart. I was working on the second or third issue of American Flag. And I was looking at a bunch of Robert Fawcett tear sheets. And all of a sudden, the pictures themselves began to separate into layers of meaning. Mm-hmm. And I called Walter. Walter's on the other side of the room. I said, you got to look at this. And we sat for an hour looking at Fawcett tear sheets, and from an analytical perspective. And at that point, I'd come to understand why he laid things out the way he did, how he organized space, and why his drawing was the way it was. You talk about that kind of magic. That's how I feel about Dave Johnson's covers.
Oh, sure.
Dave is one of the most extraordinary thinkers I've ever known. He hears me say this. I think I know he knows I mean it, but I don't flatter other people a lot, but I remain in awe of Dave's work.
Yeah.
Dave and I both just received an assignment to do variant covers for a book, and the book was terrible. I mean, the book looked like it was drawn by someone who heard about comic books once. Very well drawn, but no pictures, no narrative structure, there was nothing happening. And it was very deconstructed. It just was languid and lumbering. And I submitted 2 or 3 cover ideas. They rejected them all. They kept coming back with editorial suggestions. And Dave submitted something. Before he submitted, he said, "You can use this if you want." I said, "No, that's an archetypal Dave Johnson idea. I could not do that. It's not how I think." And he, of course, got they approved his layout immediately. It's gorgeous. It's fabulous.
Right.
It's nothing I've ever accomplished in any way. And his work just astonishes me. It staggers the fuck out of me.
Well, I'll give you a little Dave. So Dave and I were roommates and studio mates for a while, and we had that sort of that immediate connection to our early loves of creations, and so we were just like, oh, we're immediate buddies. And my description of Dave is he is so capable in so many facets that when he comes out saying, oh, like I wanted to try X, painting, whatever the thing is, he comes out of it as if he had been hiding for years, practicing this technique, then reveals it. But that's not the case. He is capable of seeing what he needs to have done and knowing what he needs to do to get to that. And it is so humbling, when you're surrounded by someone at that level where it just goes, oh man, like he's amazing.
I have to think that Johnson is the Bernie Wrightson of this generation.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah. Doesn't do enough comic books. I wish he did. I love his.
But Dave is at least smart enough to monetize his skill set.
Well, for sure. Yeah. No. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, but he's so, yeah, I don't, but he's like one of those people. There are a handful of people who just, you go, man, you know how to break or solve a problem that is just out of my reach.
Look, I have lunch on a regular basis with Dave Chiarello and Bill Sienkiewicz with occasional guests. And, it's like I'm the old man at the table by 10 years. But I mean, I look at Sienkiewicz. Sienkiewicz's work is just like, it's awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, I just don't. I'm a very conventional guy in by comparison to Bill and by comparison to Dave. I like a panel page, but I'm not. I may not work on a grid, but my work is very, it's methodical. I love that metronome reference. That is just, it really nails it in a beautiful way. I like that a lot. So when I look at a guy like Dave or Bill or Mark or Chris Samney, it's just like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Why? I mean, anecdotally, I remember I was at the Marvel offices when Golden's pencils came in, that Avengers X-Men annual he did. Just like, and Gil Kane is looking at these things, and he had a meltdown. It was like, I mean, he literally slipped into blind rage. He said, "How the fuck does he do this?"
Like, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, listen, of my generation, yeah. Of my generation, that Michael is the one, who sort of kind of kicked our minds, right, and off our head, and
he's the most influential artist that's come into comics in the past 45 years.
Yes. Oh,
there are people who built careers out of aspects and tropes that he's thrown over his shoulder.
Yeah. No. I mean, I've said it before, and apologies to everyone who's heard this before, but like, I'm super fortunate that he's been my mentor for the last 30 plus years. Like, I've known Michael, and he's been, nothing but the greatest support for me. But yeah, I remember I was at Heroes this last summer, and I can't remember who I was talking to, but I just said, like, it is very strange. Like, you look around and there's lines for people, whoever's popular. And I'm like, the guy who most everyone in here owes a lot of their work to doesn't have that line. And it's really interesting. It's just time just sort of erases all these sort of impact moments.
Well, he's also working over the heads of the audience. I mean, the audience, we've evolved into an entertainment landscape, and it applies in many ways, not just comics, where it was like, is it popular because it's good, or is it good because it's popular? And the aspirational nature of the work has become far more telling and more important than an acknowledgement of unattainable excellence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's many of the most popular guys working in the business in comics are guys who draw the way the audience would draw if it could draw.
Yeah.
And the true experts are operating in a landscape that is a mystery to the audience's perspective. They don't have the eyes to see. Well, I mean, I like challenging stuff,
but you like it because there's, and I'm telling you what you like, right, but you like it because, for the same reason that I like it, because it sets out this question mark, like what, where, when, how. Like, I need to know, and I want to engage, because that's why people become creators. Like, you cited those other phenomenal draftsmen in their right that you have lunch with, and they're all Hall of Fame people with a pencil in their hand. But the distinction is that you also have story burning in you that needs to be written down.
Well, that's it. I mean, for me, my work is defined by the synergy that exists between text and image.
Right.
That's what it's about. I mean, about a year or so ago, Bill called and said, there's going to be a lecture series in Pasadena, Traveling Illustrators. And I went down. I drove down to Pasadena, and going to Pasadena is like eating my young in the Donner Pass. It's like a long drive. And C.F. Payne delivered a lecture on design and illustration that was staggering because it pointed out and confirmed and reconfirmed so much of how I think about the the endowment of visuals with narrative content, and that the maintenance of story, the I mean, I'm one of those guys who believes that were he contemporary of mine, Robert Fawcett would be doing comics. Because he was so clearly story interested. And again, as I've said more than once, my career it stands on the shoulders of five men. And Gil Kane, Gil Kane, Wallace Wood, Gray Morrow, Neil Adams, and Joe Orlando, who was my rabbi at DC, who protected me from Carmen and Patino. And
let's talk about Joe in a minute. Okay, go ahead.
And the great unifying factor of all those guys was none of them could write worth a shit. They couldn't. Orlando was one of the best people I've ever known in my fucking life.
Oh yeah.
Just getting Joe to laugh, to make shit come out of Joe's nose, was one of the great joys of my life. He and Jack Abel were two guys that my mission in life was to make them laugh uncontrollably, embarrassingly. That was my deal. So, Joe Orlando.
Full disclosure. So I went to SVA and Joe was my teacher for 2 years. And I was his TA for his last year at SVA before he had to leave because of his heart. And that's when Carmine took over.
Don't get me started.
No. But two very different personalities. But Joe was he was flat out the best teacher I had. And because Joe didn't treat us like students and kids, his job was to put us into the fire and make us strong and hard to be able to do the job. And if you didn't want to do that, that wasn't his problem.
No, I would always assume he treated you like staff.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Like, get to it. Quit fucking up. He just, I once described him as being like the Michelin tire man in a really good suit with a sense of humor. And it was just, he was sly and funny, and he came into his own as an older man, because as a younger man, I think he felt just overshadowed by everyone around him. And he was the guy. I don't know if you're aware of this. He was the reason why the Lampoon paid such incredibly high rates for comic art.
No.
He grossly inflated what people were getting paid in comics when he got hired by the Lampoon. He was one of the first guys to get hired by the Lampoon, and he told them these rates that were obscenely high, and they believed them because they're idiots,
Good.
And they did. Thank you, Joe. And Joe picked up early on, as soon as I got to DC, that Carmine would hate me because of my association with Gil, and because they hated each other as they were children,
right?
And Joe just protected me completely. And when Bill Gaines was brought in, that Carmine's idea about having Gaines come in to play around with the DC, it was nothing, never happened. I was standing there with Weiss, and we were all a little high, and Joe just went into a rap about Cubit, yeah, Cubit. And Weiss just destroyed it. It destroyed Weiss. Weiss went batshit, and he gouted like red wine all over Joe's shirt. Joe looked at him, looked at me, looked at his shirt, and said, "Oh, what the fuck?" And it just kept going. It was fantastic. It was just the greatest. He was
bless him, man.
Everybody. I mean, Joe Orlando was as beloved a figure at DC as Frank Giacoya was at Marvel. Everybody loved Frank. Everybody loved Joe. Nobody has a bad word to say about Joe Orlando, and if they do, they're dead. Fuck.
Yeah, they never actually met the man. It's just, yeah. I really, very fortunate. I learned a lot more from him in his class, and I actually did than Will in his class. So,
but Eisner was, I respect Eisner's work in the 1940s. I'm not a fan of Bill Eisner as a person. Eisner is one of those guys who is deeply well regarded by the fans and held in a certain remove by professionals. Uh, he was not a beloved figure. I heard a great story a couple of days ago that I'd love to. I really regret not having heard it before I had room for additional back matter and Hey Kids. I don't know if it's true. No idea. It's a real snipey story, but it's a great story. Apparently, when Stanton was really hitting it hard at Marvel, and Marvel was really soaring and making serious business in the early mid '60s, Eisner put together a dinner at the Palm on 44th Street with a bunch of guys to discuss the idea of putting Stan out of business and doing we can do this right that, as opposed to the crap they're doing over there. Blah 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 blah. And nobody came along. Nobody agreed with Rill. And everybody was sort of, well, well, maybe, but no, no. Eisner excuses himself to go to the bathroom and then leaves, leaving them with the check, which I thought was an absolutely fabulous illustration. It was just, I mean, I hope it's true because it's really funny, and it's just,
Wow.
right? I love that stuff,
Yeah, I guess
But,
if you're not on board, you can pay for your own drinks. Wow. Interesting.
yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Again, it may be just as apocryphal as Toth hanging Julie Schwartz out the window, which never really happened. But as I've said more than once about Hey Kids, a lot of it didn't happen, but it's still all true.
which is that's storytelling, the so the point so the point of the point of, like I mentioned earlier about point of view in writing and how like strong that is, and I guess Flag being your sort of first real true foray into that, like was that a guiding metaphor for you, like in your selection process, or were you like was there like 50% of you saying I'll take what opportunities are out there, and then the other half is like hunting for stuff?
I think it's both. I think that I was hired by Marvel in the early aughts to teach a seminar twice a year. I did it for 6 or 7 years straight. And the first day of the seminar was me beating the hobbyism out of the guys who had been assigned to me.
Okay.
Because there was this, there's we are making a living through our hobby. Comics are an inoculation process. When you meet comics for the first time, you either are stuck with them or you step away from them. And if you're stuck with them, you can't do anything but. And one of the things I said was that you are no longer drawing comics for yourself on your mother's cutting board in the middle of the night on the dining table while everybody else is asleep. Then you start taking money from these people, you're a corporate cog. You're not putting one over on the man by behaving like an amateur, unprofessional asshole. Rather, you're letting writers get away with murder at your expense. And they're looking at me like, oh my God. Because I have a reputation for being a contrarian and anti-corporatist and everything else. But my sensibility, as I said earlier in this chat, is that you do the work to the same level of quality for whomever you're working. And I aged out of Marvel and DC over a decade ago. The phone stopped ringing years ago. I'm good with that. I don't solicit work, so I'm okay with that too. And the reality is that sometimes you just got to make a living.
Yeah.
I no longer bill for work. I work for free. I work exclusively on the back end because I can afford to. Because I took measures to make that possible. I've said recently that every choice I made outside of comic books was intended to make it possible for me to do comic books. In the 1970s, when I started my career, comics paid so shittily that the only way you could make a real living was if you had an advertising skill set on top of it. To that, I owe Neil a great deal. I was grateful to get every couple of months a week's worth of work working at JWT or BBD&O or BBD, doing teeny frames for a day. And the day rate for that was $1.50. $150 a day. If you get 4 of those in a row, you made your month's nut.
Yeah.
And that turned into comps and everything else. And I worked a lot of accounts for B&B. I did a lot of cigarette ads. I did a lot of commercials for stuff. And that made it possible to do comic books. By the time Flag came along, I was so in debt from having worked for Byron Price, because there was no money from Byron at all, that Flag, the money that was offered on Flag, saved my life. It eliminated my debt and made it possible for me to buy real estate. Nobody likes to hear this in comics because they want this idea that comic book talent are a bunch of happy-go-lucky guys like Stan presented. But the truth is, it's a job, it's a career, and it requires actual effort. And I worked in television. I moved to California specifically because I recognized the fact that despite the critical acclaim that Flag had achieved, despite the attention I was accruing, it did not turn into money. I was not making anywhere near. I was not. I was selling one issue of Flag to every 10, 20 of Watchmen or Dark Knight. Not that it was better or worse,
Right.
but that for all the transgressive nature of both those books, they still looked like superhero comic books, and they still dealt with an audience that had been primed and induced to identify that as material it would want. And even back then, I recognized that Watchmen was a cautionary tale that ultimately became a training manual. Much like what makes Sammy run was written as a cautionary tale in the 1930s and became John Peters' guidebook, how to run his business. So I moved to California specifically to try to use the credential that I had derived from American Flag to get into movie writing, and I ended up in television. It saved my life. I never worked on a television show I'd watch, but it saved my ass. It gave me a pension, and it gave me real estate, and it made it possible for me to be this old and not be a drag on the system.
Right.
And I grew up on welfare, and I know what being a drag on the system feels like. It's shaming, and it's embarrassing. When I hear these Republican cockbags talk about welfare queens, nobody's taken any pleasure in living in a state of poverty. Poverty is not a choice; it is an imposition. And I'm very grateful for the fact that I developed an actual work ethic in my late 20s, early 30s, which made it possible for me to step away from living on that kind of life. And it's hard because comic books does not attract with all due respect, does not attract a mental giant population. And there are many people in the comic book business who seem simply earnestly believe that the attention and fame they're achieving today is going to remain that way tomorrow and the next week, and that's not necessarily the case. As you said with Michael, um, you know, the eyes of the audience are fickle, and there's a profound cultural amnesia that exists across the board in general, but in comics it's very particular. Um, the audience really does not have an educated perspective to identify quality beyond aspiration.
Right.
It's and there are guys out there who are usually popular, whose skill sets would have make them, would have been good guys for airbrushing wizards on the sides of bands. Just I mean, come on. But you have an audience that literally was infantilized along with the comic book product in 1955.
And then, I mean, listen, the predominant number of people getting into the business are coming from that point of view as well. So, I mean, you have to balance that out. And it's tough because, this air, this quote fame of whatever it is in comics is sort of really unique in the terms that you're becoming famous based off of a famous property that you're working on by and large. So it's sort of like if you were hey, I'm the keyboard player for the Beatles, like confusing the fact that you are the famous one, not because you're in the Beatles. Like, I mean, drawing the X-Men is like being in the Beatles.
I never thought of it quite that way, but I guess you're right. I mean, I didn't have the goods to attach myself to a super character at the time. So I was denied the access to achieving the attention and fame that is mostly the route by which most of my colleagues and contemporaries took to achieve any attention and fame. And so ultimately I had to do other stuff. And the other stuff I did is not of a particular interest to an audience that likes super monster, mutant, dragon, space stuff. And you talked earlier about my interest in science fiction. I got wooed away from science fiction by Archie Goodwin and into crime stuff. And when I have done science fiction since then, I feel like I'm hitting false notes. I don't respond as an audience to this work. I'm not a huge fan. I try to watch. I'm surrounded. I watch all that news. I'd never seen the old Star Trek series. I had a social life at that point, And I watched the first season of the new show on Paramount Plus or whatever it was, and I was like, this is like bullshit. It's like, why are they listening to 1970s music? Is that like us? Should we be listening to harpsichord and clavichord? Is that what's going on? No, no. I found it incredibly patronizing and pandering. But then I come to realize that most of the stuff that's really successful today is patronizing and pandering.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, look, I mean, Batman, as I've said more than once, is about a 14-year-old boy's idea of what a rich guy who had a bad day when he was 8 would do with his money.
Yeah.
And you know, the fact that you now have an entire audience of grown men and women, you know, mostly men, who are losing their hair, who are still entertained and intrigued by this stuff is staggering to me. But I'm convinced that, you know, one of the reasons why Dark Knight was so popular was because it confirmed the hopes and suspicions of the audience. That it confirmed that you're entitled to like this stuff. It's okay. It's good. It's good. You're fine. Don't worry about it. You'll be fine. It's good. It's good. You're
Right.
fine. I'm not convinced. You know, and I like comics. I'm a comic book man. It's my medium I work in, but I'm not interested in those stories that continue to be about that stuff.
You know, you said you sort of got seduced into crowdfunding, you know, because you kept it at arm's length. What was the tipping point for you to go?
The enthusiasm that was enlisted in by I was enlisted by that enthusiasm from Mike Stratford, who was the progenitor of this project. He's the guy who showed me the work, and Jordan Prosky at Zoop. I got caught up in the maelstrom enthusiasm, and you know, you know, I respond reflexively to Star Spangled Banner, so I guess there's something of that in me as well. You know, you know, I'm not easily seduced, and you know, but I can be abandoned. You know. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we were talking about the fights and tights world of comics and how it dominates things, but Howard, I'm totally in the belief that we are in this sort of golden era of the medium, that people can actually do almost anything in comics to an audience.
I completely agree. But it's so nichey.
Yes.
You know, it is so niche based. I mean, you know, we just finished the final touches of the complete trade paperback volume 3 of Hey Kids Comics. And I know full well that when we do the omnibus, which is a given, it'll happen, there'll be more back matter. Maybe that Eisner story may show up in there after all. And we're going to be doing a Black Kiss omnibus for next year as well. And I'll be doing a new 10 to 20 page story, a Halloween story. So yeah, it's very niche based, but the market remains dominated by super duper stuff and the anime stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the anime stuff has this short shelf life, whereas the superhero stuff, people seem to get old reading it. So you know, I'm hoping that you know, I'm assuming after I'm dead, I'll be noticed at this, but that the niche work deserves attention alongside the more popular commercial stuff. I mean, I really don't chase commercial ideas. I chase ideas that intrigue and interest me. You know, I having finished Hey Kids, and this is being on my desk right now. My editor asked me, "What's next? What are we going to do next?" And I don't know yet. I don't know.
Right.
I don't have any idea. I'd love to find a way to do something actually funny. You know, I mean, a comedy book. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, but I don't know if I have the goods or the skill set. I don't know. Who can say? You know, people. Oh, you're so funny. I'm not funny. I'm clever. I'm witty. You know, I'm spontaneously clever. You know, but not funny in a traditional get up and make people laugh sense. You know. And I'm a polarizing figure. I'm easy to dislike because you know, I have florets instead of Tourette's. You know,
not being afraid to express yourself. You know, that sense of challenge to, you know, whatever people may think is what decorum or status quo should be is divisive, and that sucks because it's not that like it's intentionally like I want to fuck with some you or what you like. It doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. Like what you believe and what I believe can be completely different, but we can still, coexist.
Look, I mean, I have a capacity to I contain multitudes, as I've said more than once.
What?
Yeah, well, it's like Walt Whitman, America's favorite homosexual racist poet. I mean, I love that stuff. I mean, I have I don't have an affinity for opportunism. It skipped me, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah.
I'm also really lucky, as I've said more than once, that I identified that there would be a problem should I get this old, and I did something about it when I could. That's a really important thing for me. Um, that I'm an ant in a grasshopper's business. And for those of you who actually grew up, with an education, you read Aesop. That's an Aesop fable. It's called The Grasshopper and the Ant. Look it up. And it's astonishing how people are what ant grasshopper. Um, I'm a grind, and I mean, the blessing of my life I identified as a curse as a young man. As a young man, I realized that I had no real talent, but I had hunger and blind rage. And that hunger and blind rage transformed itself into the grinding effect of cerebrally attaching myself to a skill set and developing a skill through repetition, not osmosis, but actual labor.
Yeah.
And then doing that labor puts me in the position of being able to teach how to learn how to do what we do. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to listen. Anytime we get a long form thing that you've done, and be able to plug it into my brain, it's always exciting to me. So I'm,
This is not a deep thinking thought piece. It's an
right.
absolute. It's a rip snorting. My generation earnestly believed that we were going to be the rebirth of a new EC back in the 70s because we didn't realize that we would not. We always thought we'd survive superhero comic books, that we'd outgrow them because superhero comics are drawn by 40-year-old guys our dad's age for children who are our younger brother's age. But we didn't realize that there would be a new bunch of guys coming in to draw superhero comics that looked nothing like what we had thought they'd look like, and we were gobsmacked and never recovered. I still chase that EC vibe, and for me, when I was a kid, it was about the science fiction books. Then it became about the crime books and the shock books, but it has always been the two-fisted and front lines. And I love the idea of adventure stories. And when I hear about the anecdotes that Harvey talks about having had Alan and Bill had no idea what he meant, it's so obvious. I mean, it's just there's so much material out there. There's Graham Greene. There's in more contemporary terms, there's John Lawton. There's Ali Monroe. There's so much stuff out there that just demands that this kind of short fiction stuff, and I'm delighted to get the opportunity to work my chops out on this kind of material, and I love
Yeah.
this stuff. I would strongly encourage you to get out there and take a look at the Zoop campaign for Fargo Hell on Wheels. I'd be grateful and delighted and flattered.
The campaign, let's see, this is Halloween, spooky Halloween. This comes out. So, what do we have? Like a week and a half
Yeah,
from, so
I think November 10th. Yes.
great. And they can go to zoop.gg. Of course, if you type in Zoop anywhere, it'll come up and it'll be in the description. The link will go right. People can chase it down. And you've got a murderer's row of people helping you out on art prints and all sorts of stuff.
It's going to be a great package at a great price. I cannot convey that highly enough. I mean, I'm astonished at how we're coming in as we are. And again, let us get us to the finish line. I'd be really grateful. I'll be your best friend.
No, look at that. Uncle Howie will be your best friend.
It's pathetic. I often describe myself as the weird Uncle Carl of grandparents, and that's how it is. When I visit my grandson once a month, and we cook. We cook together. So that's the kind of life I'm living. How prosaic is that? Yes, it is prosaic, but it's me. So Hey, Alex, thanks so much for having me. I'm
Yeah,
very
but this
grateful.
was an absolute pleasure. I was told I would have a great time by many of our familiar friends. So I'm glad that we were able to do this. Thanks, Howard.
They don't call me the Archbishop of Fun for nothing. I mean, that's really what it's about. So again,
Most
thanks again. And again, please love me, or at least pretend you like me. That'll work for me. Have a great day.